Okay, so I think there's been a little bit of talk about MerbAuth lately. This is a new authentication framework that we've developed for Merb recently, and it's very recent, but I think it's kind of cool. So when I started looking at authentication, I really liked the idea of being able to just drop in some basic user stuff to get started. When I was doing Rails, RESTful authentication was my bread and butter, basically. I really used it all the time, but there was a few things that perhaps I didn't really like about it. And when I came over to Merb, there was simply just nothing like that available. The generators were reasonable. But then after a little while, we started using RubyGen, and that had some interesting features. So I really missed RESTful authentication. So because of that, I started off with MerbFull authentication, and I ported RESTful authentication over. It was basically a direct port of RESTful authentication. There was nothing extra. There was no new stuff, and it was at the time. When I say there's no new stuff, there was a data mapper support built in and active record support built in. So in terms of the functionality of your website for your users, there wasn't really anything new, but for Merb there was. This was basically the first kind of plugin that allowed for ORM differentiation within generated code. So you could ask for a data mapper version of it, or you could ask for an active record version of it by using the use ORM in the init file. So this was kind of the first test bed, I guess, for that kind of thing. So we got a lot of people who used it, I think, and I certainly used it in quite a few applications, but it was generated code, and it was really, really complicated to try and maintain it. If anybody goes through the original one and just looks at the code generation with all the options that's in it that you've got to switch on, and try and make sure that you allow for this and allow for that, and it just starts to really suck badly. It's not scalable at all if you try and, we never did end up putting SQL support into it, for example, because it was just sort of too difficult. So I was really looking for something new, some other way, some non-generated way of doing authentication. And slices came about, so I thought this was a really nice idea. So we went for MerbAuth from MerbFull authentication. So it sort of grew up a little bit. We changed it around. It was a direct port from MerbFull authentication. There wasn't a whole bunch different that we did. We did a few things like forgotten passwords. We added that functionality in fairly early into that one. But it did test out the slices plugin, which was very new at the time. Some of the slices development was influenced by MerbAuth, so it sort of helped us drive what's useful and what's not in the slices a little bit, which is kind of cool. It used library code, so that the idea being hopefully the community would contribute, and everybody would benefit if somebody improved it. That's the sort of idea, which is completely unavailable with the generated code, which is something I really wanted to get away from. We moved away from switching ORMs based on the use ORM tag to using Mixins. So you basically select which one you're going to use and mix it in directly into your user model. You could select whatever kind of user model you liked, provided that it was an ORM. That was one of the constraints. So, sorry, I've sort of got ahead of myself there. Onto the cons. The problem with it was, and there was numerous problems, some of these problems were also available in the generator, the user model got hidden away. So a lot of times I'd get questions, how do I modify my user model correctly? What do I do there? More often it was, how do I modify my controller? How do I add a new action in? How do I redirect to a different place? How do I change the error message that I'm getting? All those kind of questions would come through. And yes, there was a lot of configuration options to put those in and change a lot. But the amount of configuration options just started to feel really sort of bloated and complicated. You had to try and put every case in to try and meet everybody's needs. Because it dictated what you were going to use as a user model, and it kind of dictated a whole bunch of other things like sign-ups and things like that, you had to try and cover everybody's use case, which is just so totally not scalable. I've done several applications now where MerbAuth, I just couldn't use it, for example, because I needed to have API access. I needed to log in different sites. Sites needed to use my code rather than a person, but I also needed to have people log in. So these kind of things were just unavailable in the old slice version of MerbAuth. Extensions were kind of difficult. To try and do something like OpenID, we never actually got a plugin for OpenID, although I was hoping for one. We never got that because it did kind of suck to write extensions for that. It again was complex. So we needed something to change. Just none of those solutions really sat well with me. I really didn't like them. And in IRC one day, Adam French, who works at WIC, came and started talking to me and suggested that rather than authenticating the controller, which is, it doesn't really sit well, we should authenticate the sessions because that's where the user sort of is. The user is in the session. You can think of the session as the common thread all the way through the request, right? As we saw in the router, the session is available in the router. It's according to the request, and then it can also be available after the controller's finished. So any point in the code, in terms of a request response cycle, the session is available. So we really should be authenticating on that. We need a simple API, and one of the strengths with Merb is that by raising a controller exception, your response codes are automatically set correctly. So one of the things that we found was that when we used something like MerbAuth and you failed to log in, you would be redirected. So you would just get a redirect code, which suggests that the content had moved, which isn't quite right. So we wanted to really provide the correct status codes back to the client, because Merb is more about services than anything. There's a whole lot of infrastructure to allow you to provide different services from the same controller. So status codes becoming important in Merb, and this is one way that we can exploit the framework to be more correct in HTTP REST. So Adam created an example application where we use that as a bit of a playground called exceptional authentication, and that's in his GitHub repo still. We started working on that. We collaborated on it for quite a while to make sure that we hammered out the correct API. We got the concept going for it to a point that we were happy. And you can see that we've got a fairly simple session API there. There's only a few things that we actually want to do to perform a login. Okay, we want to ask the session, are you authenticated? We want to tell it to actually authenticate against the request, stick a session in, stick a user into the session, get a user out of the system, and then get them out again, log them out. So that's really, in terms of authentication, that was kind of what we came up with. That is the main crux of the problem. There's not a whole lot additional to that in terms of authentication. I think one of the main things that one of the understandings that we came to was that authentication is not user management. So when we authenticate, we just want to make sure that a request is allowed to receive a particular response. So that's really important thing for me to sort of internalize, that we didn't have to provide all the user system, all the infrastructure to provide users, because that's up to your application. I have no idea what your user system might be. So we didn't want to go through that. So we made it fairly agnostic. So we called this MerbAuth while we were developing it. And it's compared to the last two, it's really a lot more in the Merb philosophy. It's not really rigid and prescriptive. It's not an authentication plugin as such. It's a framework to allow you to build your authentication for your application. It extracts out some of the more common concepts of that authentication. We use an idea of a strategy. So it's a strategy will just contain a bit of logic to say, is this request authenticated? And you can have many of these and cascade them. We support in MerbAuth any kind of user object, whether that's a hash, a string, an ORM object, file, whatever it is that you want to identify your user by. You might, we did an example yesterday where we're using OpenID, and all we did was store the identity URL in the session. That was it. We didn't even touch the database. We weren't interested in it. So MerbAuth seriously is not a user management system. With Stack, we integrate users a little harder into it. But at its core, and you can just install the core, there's two parts to MerbAuth. There's Merb Core, which is all just the core functionality, and then you've got Merb More, which is some default strategies that we've put together, some user mix-ins and things like that, to try and make it easy for people for common cases. And Merb Stack makes use of these. So Merb Stack puts all these things together into the MerbAuth metagem, and it will include automatically a password slice, which will do password authentication and basic authentication. It will make your user a salted user. You can turn these things off, but it will do that. It'll set up the routes for you. It'll have the login form. It will display any errors that you might come up against. So these things are automatically included in the generated application for Merb Stack, which you can also easily turn off. They're only there just to help you get going, really. It's just to give you an idea of how to do it. So when you generate your brand new application, you have a basic user model built into it that's generated. You can delete it or turn it off, whatever you like. To activate it, you DB auto migrate, but you also need something to protect. So you need to create yourself a resource, and to do that, you could use MerbGen resource, for example, to get yourself a controller. Now, once you've got your controller, you need to protect it. So there's two ways we can protect the controller with MerbAuth. We can either do it in the router and protect URLs, or we can come down into the controller and drop down and be very specific on the actions that we want to protect with a before filter. So once we've added a user to our system, we go to login and we log into it. And that's effectively, it shouldn't be any more difficult than that to set it up in the default stack. There's a whole lot more customization that you can do with it. You don't have to use the default stack version. That's just something that we've put together to help people get started. So if we wanted to go into router-based protection, this will actually run your strategies, and you can have many based on how you declare it. And you can see there I've got a couple of different protect blocks. The outer one, I'm just checking for basic authentication. The inner one, where there's no arguments, I'm protecting effectively for every strategy that's defined if there's no arguments placed in it. And it'll work its way from the outside in. So basic auth will be run or tried, right? It'll try to log you in with basic authentication for all of those routes. When you get down into, but for the API one, it will only try basic auth. It won't bother trying any password authentication or anything like that. It will just be basic authentication. So you can do that in the router, and I'm sure that you can get a whole lot more complex than that. You can define fairly reasonably fine-grained in the router that you want to protect even just one particular match, if that's what you want to protect with a particular strategy or a group of strategies, if you like. You can pass multiples. So when you want to go to controller base, it's a similar thing. You use a before method, before filter with a method, and you can pass it again. The particular strategies. If you don't pass it an argument, it will use every strategy you've listed. If you do pass it an argument, it will try each one in order. And it will just keep going until it finds one that passes or fails, in which case it will ditch you out to a login form. So why would we want to protect the routes? kind of, routes can sort of change a bit, and I guess the idea of what you might want to protect can change a bit, but one of the main benefits with why you would want to protect the route is because of the way that to fulfill a request and a response, all the different things that you need to do. If you come into the dispatcher, this is how basically Merb goes through the request response cycle. You come into the dispatcher, it goes into the router, you perform your authentication there. If you want to redirect or fail or send back a basic authentication request, if you're doing it in the controller, you've basically got to create a controller object and go into the filters and run the filters and do it all there. And you're much further along the request response cycle before you stop. So by doing it in the router, you can stop right at the dispatcher and it will pass a rack object back up to rack and stop right there. It won't bother going forward any further than that. So you can drop out of the request cycle fairly early on by protecting your routes. So what's a strategy? I've talked a lot about these cascading strategies, and you can use multiples and one after, you can use one after the other. A strategy is whatever you want it to be. It's just a class that inherits from Merb authentication strategy that has a run method, or run bang method. You can put as much arbitrary logic as you like into it. It's just a class, right? So you can write your own. It's really simple. The params, the request is available to give you the query parameters. The parameters are available to give you whatever route parameters you might have. So you can get into the session, you can get into the parameters, you can put whatever logic you like, you can access your database. You can do as much crazy testing for login as you like. It's seriously, I'm trying not to constrain anybody here in terms of what your particular authentication logic may be. The only thing that you need to do with a run method is if your user is authenticated, you need to return something that doesn't evaluate to nil or false. If it returns nil or false, it will go on to the next one. If it doesn't return nil or false, it will stop right there and assume you're now logged in. Okay, so you can declare a lot of them and they'll just run one after the other until it finds the first one that returns an object. Well, I've just talked about most of this. So by default, the strategy order is however you declare them. As you declare them, they're stored up there into that array of default strategy order. So as you declare them, it keeps track and it will apply them as declared. If you don't like that particular order, you can change it around to suit your own needs. It will just keep going. But what happens when you return an object, it will log you in, okay? But when you don't return an object, what happens is it raises an unauthenticated exception. Actually raises the exception, which dumps you through Merb's mechanisms out into the exceptions controller, into the unauthenticated method. Right, so Merb just handles exceptions via methods in that controller. So anywhere in your application, including the router, if you want to log somebody out or refuse entry, you can just raise that exception and it will dump them out into the unauthenticated. Yes.
So can you subclass the exceptions to provide your own exceptions to pass back? So can you subclass the exception that allows you to, so that you can pass back your own exceptions and not just failed to authenticate?
You can. The unauthenticated one is just the one that I've set up to use, and all you really have to do is set up your login form there. Right? You can actually, if you want to return something else, you're quite welcome to, but you just need to be aware that when you do, you need to provide some kind of login form. Effectively, exceptions unauthenticated, all that does is call session abandon so that you log out and it provides a login form for you. Okay, so whatever exception you need for your application, you should just call session abandon and then provide a login form or whatever you're expecting it to provide. So in that way, for example, you can set your own status code by doing that. Like you might not be happy with the 401 that we raise for unauthenticated. You might want something else, in which case you you can surely do that. There's no problem at all. So when you fail, it does that. It takes you to the unauthenticated. You can change it up and respond with whatever kind of format you like. You can provide your login form. But also, in your strategies, you can add errors, and you can display these errors with the standard form helper, and it will come out in the normal error format by passing it the session authentication object. It has errors built into it, just like the data mapper ORM. So we just talked about customizing the login form. So you can do that there to whatever you like. You just create your view in whatever format you need and customize it there. We also touched on that. When you log out, you just need to abandon the session, and that will remove all your user data out of it. It will clear it. So in terms of strategies that we already have implemented, we've got a password strategy which will take some kind of token, which is by default is the login parameter, and it will take a password. We've got OpenID built in that you can start using. We used it yesterday in a test application, as I was saying before. We've got basic authentication. I'm sorry, I don't really know what I meant by that next line now that I'm up here. We can monkey patch any parts of the ones that we've got in these defaults. They're set up in such a way that they're kind of library code. They're driven to be library code. So there's a whole bunch of methods that you can override to customize those. So in terms of configuration, rather than go for configuration a lot, there's a little bit, but rather than go for configuration, because if I just said, okay, to change this, here's some configuration object. There's not a whole lot of flexibility in there, so rather than that, we use Ruby's inherent strength and allow you just to reopen the strategy and overwrite particular methods to provide your own logic. So for the OpenID, there's a whole series of callbacks, like on success, on failure, on cancel, that you can just overwrite. By default, they do pretty sensible things, but they may not do what you want. So you're quite welcome to overwrite them. We've got a couple of mix-ins. The salted user mix-in adds password confirmation, the authenticate. It does quite a few things. It tells the object how to serialize in and out of the session, that kind of thing. We've got a redirect mix-in which redirects back. The reason why that's a mix-in and not just included in core is because it uses before filters and might be slowing your application down. So if you don't want it, don't include it. Right. When you want to get into advanced strategies, as I touched on before, they're just loaded in the order that you declare them. So you can come up with any strategy you like and just declare them one after the other. All you need is to implement a run method. There's a way with the strategies that you can declare them as abstract, so that when you declare this strategy, you can put a whole heap of logic into it. And you can even say define your run logic. Say, for example, you might take the default password strategy. You might say, right, that is now abstract because I don't want that to be run in that way. What I want you to do is I'll inherit and create another strategy, and I'll set the user class that it's going to use to this other class, and then I'll inherit again and I'll set it to some other class. So you might say student logins go through this strategy, teacher logins go through that strategy, and it will just take that into account automatically by setting the user class. So you can use that user class method and inherit from your strategies, mark them abstract. So the abstract ones won't run. You can put whatever logic you like in it, it won't actually run them. I keep getting ahead of myself, I'm sorry. So when you're running your strategy, when you want to write it, you can redirect, which is really important for, say, OpenID or OAuth. You can make it abstract. You've got complete control to set the headers in the response. You can set the status in the response. You can also set the body and all the parameters. And because you've got the request object available, you've also got the session object available. So there's a whole lot of information available to you at that point to make your decision on whether or not this request should be actually authenticated and what kind of object it is. You can add arbitrary errors, just like in your database, inside the strategy. So you can just use a label and a message to say, no, you've got an error. You can clear that too. There's a clear method. So when you go to set up your strategies, you basically require MerbAuth core. That's the only thing that you need. That has all the strategies in it, all the strategy class in it, the authentication, how you get in and out of the session. You set up your session storage, which by that I mean you need to tell it how to serialize your object in and out of the session. Okay, in the Merb stack, I do that for you in a Mixin. In the salted user Mixin, it tells it how to serialize in and out. But if you're just using it by yourself to create your own strategies, then you might want to tell it, or you need to tell it, how do you serialize whatever this object is that you're going to store in the session to say that it's authenticated. How do you serialize it and retrieve it from the session? So you need to tell it that. You might just store a string, or you might store a marshaled object, for example, into the session. So you can get it in and out again. But you need to tell it that. You could even use a case statement for different types of objects to say, this object you serialize this way, this object you serialize that way, you know, and you can get it in and out. And it's pure Ruby code, so totally flexible. So in terms of what I want to do with it next is I want to get some slices to help people just sort of get up and running really quickly. We've got the one password slice at the moment. We've got one Mixin. It would be really nice to see some things like OAuth. I know somebody's working on activated user, which will hook into the authentication method and do some things there. Maybe LDAP. I mean, things like these would be good strategies to make into plugins, because a lot of people might use those kind of things. You know, maybe a Google strategy to log into the Google API. That would be another one that would be something that would be quite good to have. Some of the resources you've got, there's been a couple of early adopters that have tried really hard to help me to develop it. Some of the guys on IRC have got in and actually made some example applications. These are mostly just working off MerbAuth core. They don't even really use the built-in strategies. They're just completely custom. You've got Adam French. When we first started this, he made a blog post talking about the ideas that led to this idea. And you can see there that, well, that's old. I need to update that. It doesn't actually live in Merb plugins anymore. It lives in MerbMore. So, sorry about that one. So I've got to say thank you really to Adam French for working with me to get it going, Ben Burkett, who helped me to make it really flexible by being class-based. And of course Engine who's given me a lot of time to work on this and a lot of resources. So I really think this is a great plugin, and I really think it's going to help set up authentication in a Merb way. It's totally non-prescriptive if you don't want it to be, except that you're using the session and you need to tell it how to serialize in and out. That's about as prescriptive as it is. You have to be able to serialize in and out of the session. Other than that, you're pretty much free to sort of implement it however you like. Okay, and thank you, that's it.
So I've got one from Abdul from Amsterdam. He's asking, can I still define to show a different page from someone who failed an OpenID login compared to someone who failed to log into an OAuth authentication?
Right, so if you wanted to do that, what you could do is subclass the unauthenticated exception, for example, and you could make different methods inside your exception controller and do it that way. That's one way you could do it. It also, you can, in your strategy, set a message on the exception that will tell it whether you failed from OpenID or whether you failed from whatever. So you can, it's up to you how you want to do that, but there's certainly mechanisms available to choose where you want to go to. If you can just create different exceptions, for example, as I said, and raise those. That will take you to a different path.
The problem of role-based authorization obviously isn't what you're trying to solve here, but at the same time, using routes and the strategy pattern that you've used seems to apply pretty well. What do you think the right approach would be? Do you think trying to tie role-based authentication into into this plugin or use this plugin with it, or do you think it's more appropriate to attack that problem separately?
I think that's a really separate problem to tackle, and I have been thinking about how that might be done. It's certainly not authentication, it's authorization, which would be the role-based. The authentication is just, is this person who they say they are? Whereas the authorization says, can this person do this action? So they're quite separate, but I think that this plugin is A, flexible enough to allow you to do whatever you need to do in your situation, but B, it's got a public API, so you don't have to try and guess, for example, what the current user method is because you're not using user, you're using person, for example. You just go to session and say session.user and it will provide you back whatever it is you need. So I think it's got a strong foundation to build a sister plugin for that. I think that would certainly be the way to go. It would certainly need to be a slice because there would be routes that you'd need to take into account in that situation. But I think it's stable enough because the API is very small. If you rely on that, I don't see any reason why you couldn't build a plugin on top of that that relies on it.
So you mentioned it's not suitable for, or the scope is not to do user management. So what are the things, aspects of user management that we'd have to build a slice around, like forgotten password and register sign up? Are those the things that you're thinking?
Forgotten password, I think, I've got a plan to make a forgotten password slice. Whether or not that'll go into MerbAuth or whether that'll go into Merb plugins somewhere. I'm not quite sure yet, I haven't discussed it. But there's things about user management that I miss, but they just don't belong in here. We need to keep this focused so that it is flexible and it is modular. And those things have no reason to be in there. There's nothing saying that forgotten passwords has to be in that place. So yes, I've got plans to build a slice for that, but no, I'm not going to put that into MerbAuth because I think it would just bloat it up a little.
So maybe we're talking down the road of 3 different slices with MerbAuth and user management and role-based authorization. That might be the
Maybe
future.
an activation, you may need activation, say, which would also require a slice. Now the slice, I mean, I guess a slice sounds large, but really it's just a gem that you can route to. So you can put controllers in it because authorization requires a controller action to be able to authorize against. So that would need to be a slice in that case. And there's actually a guy, and I'm not sure of his name, but he's IRC Nick, he's CK, the guy with the cookbook example there. He's actually working at the moment on an activation slice for users. So that's not quite ready yet, but it is in the works, and the forgotten password one's not. That shouldn't be overly difficult to implement.
I would also say that one of the fantastic things about the fact that everything's a gem is that you can make a gem depend on other gems. So I would anticipate pretty much any role-based authentication, authorization-related stuff to just rely on MerbAuth, depend on MerbAuth. That way we could build a community around the final big solution that has everything in it without people getting all scattered and building their own half solutions all over the place. So, and that's part of Merb Stack, so you can pretty much assume that most people have MerbAuth.
So Daniel, I used to use a lot RESTful auth with Rails, and so you had basically a view and you had libraries that were generated for you. You didn't go this way. In my case, it was always hard to change. Like if I wanted to change the way a user would log in, instead of using a login, he would use his email and password. In the generated slices that comes with MerbStack, how did you address that? Is that something easy to do, or?
It is, yes. In the stack, and this is mostly for stack, but also for the default strategies, this is built into it, and stack just uses it. There's a couple of files in the lib directory of stack for authentication, and one of them is setup and one of them is strategies. So there's a place where you can define your setup and define your strategies. In there's a big chunk of documentation for the options that are available with the default stack. So there's an option there to change what your login parameter is. There's an option to change your password parameter. You can change which strategies you want to be loaded by default and in which order you'd like them to be run. There's a couple other things that you can change as well in there, and the documentation's in there to let you know what, by default, what you can do. But there's, in my mind, the way I'm thinking at the moment, because you can just reopen the class, if there's not an option for what you want, it's pretty easy to add it.
So with the default slice, if I change from the login to the email for the user to actually log in, does that also change the view for me?
Yes, it does. It changes the views, it changes the errors, the error messages that are given to the users if they fail login. But it is a simple login form, so you probably, if you want anything more complicated like OpenID to be integrated into it, you'd need to come up with your own login form. It really is just a simple one to get you started. Okay, thank you guys.
Right, thank you. We have